As I told you already, we are half an hour behind our schedule, so I would like to ask you to be disciplined. I would like to ask the speakers of this session to stick to the time provided, because we should not be too late. I have the honor to moderate this session on civilizations, discrimination, and populism. I would say summarizing everything which concerns us nowadays. Civilizations, their relations, discrimination, something which should not happen as it's prohibited by Universal Declaration on Human Rights, several other international documents. Nevertheless, there is discrimination also within civilizations, and populism is also one of the concerns of today. So I make my remarks very short to give more time to the speakers, and I invite Jonathan Fox from Bar-Ilan University in Israel to speak on civilization clash, or Balderdash, or as you come from Israel, I could say civilization dash clash or schmonzes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to have a PowerPoint.
And the causes of religion discrimination in Western European Christian majority democracies. You have the floor.
This clicker should work? Great. Okay, I'm going to be coordinating between laptops, so this screen matches that screen, even though that screen's off of that laptop, so I apologize if I get a little confused. My talk is Civilizational Clash, or Balderdash, the Causes of Religious Discrimination in Western and European Christian Majority Democracies. I'm going to start with a few definitions, because I very strongly believe we must define what we're talking about, because discrimination can mean many things. I'm specifically talking about two types of discrimination, which I'm defining very specifically because this is what I'm measuring in the empirical portion of the study. There's certainly other ways to define it, but this is how I am defining it. Government-based religious discrimination are restrictions placed on the religious practices or institutions of religious minorities that are not placed on the majority religion. To discriminate means to treat differently. If you're doing it to everybody, it is repression, it could be persecution, it is not discrimination. Societal religious discrimination are actions taken against minority religions by members of society who do not directly represent the government. If the government is doing it, it's governmental. This has to be actors who are not directly connected to the government. So let's move on. Now, causes of discrimination, one. I'm going to test a few theories here. One of them is the Civilisations Theory. Most of you know that. Huntington argues that post-Cold War conflict will be between various civilizations. There are question marks after two of them because Huntington is sort of unsure in his own writings as to whether or not they are civilizations. He believes the clashes between civilizations will be more common and more violent. This applies both to international and domestic conflict, and he believes that Muslims will be particularly violent, especially against the West. There are a lot of critiques against this theory. I could actually talk about Huntington's critics for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, but I'm going to keep it down to less, discussing only the critiques based on empirical, quantitative studies. And they almost unanimously find the theory to simply not be true. Conflicts within civilizations are more common by anybody who goes around counting them. Civilization is a poor predictor of conflict when you stick it into multivariate analyses. And religion actually happens to be a better predictor than civilization, because the two are not exactly alike when you measure them. Survey-based studies, they do tend to find that religion or even the civilization can predict some factors, but religion, used without Huntington's filter of civilization, tends to work better for those who actually directly compare the two. Most studies don't, but the few that do actually find that to be the case. There are Now, if you look at specific studies of religious minorities that have been done in the past, non-civilizational minorities experience more discrimination. Religion has a greater impact on discrimination. Grimm and Finke also find the theory not to work in their seminal book, The Price of Freedom Denied, which is a very great book on religious freedom if you want to look at it, although they define it a bit differently than I do. Despite that, many studies, most of them non-quantitative, seem to like Huntington's theory. He comes up again and again, and he's mentioned favorably very often. So I'm going to start with assuming Huntington is correct, we would expect both societal religious discrimination, which I abbreviate SRD, and government religious discrimination, which I abbreviate GRD. You'd be amazed how many words you can shave from a paper by doing that. Will be higher against minorities whose civilization is different from that of the majority religion. That is what Huntington would predict. Now, I'm also going to look at some other theories and compare them and see if they work better. Now, another one is the Securitization of Islam, which was actually pioneered by Jocelyn Cesari, but I'm very happy to cite her and steal the theory from her and make use of it for myself. She doesn't seem to mind too much, so we're all good. When a group is perceived as an existential threat, the process of securitization might occur. And once a group is securitized, perceived as such a threat, it is removed from normal politics and becomes extraordinary. Basically, this theory is designed to explain how you can engage in certain actions that are taken against minorities in democracies, even though these actions are very much against the morals of democracies. It doesn't have to be a religious minority. Unfortunately, the internment camps going up in the US right now, the separating of parents and children, it's a very terrible thing, but I think securitization theory does a good job of explaining that too. This is the type of thing it's designed to explain, and has also been used to explain discrimination against Muslims in the Western world. So let's just keep going. That's basically what it says. So this gets us to the next hypothesis, is we would expect both types of discrimination to be more common against Muslims because they are a minority that is believed to be securitized in the West, but we would also expect any minority that engages in violent or threatening actions might possibly be securitized, and this would result in more discrimination against them. So that's theory number 2. Theory number 3 are anti-cult policies. There are a lot of cults or groups called cults in the West. The actual definition of cult is not at all agreed upon in the literature, and they focus on various things. The cult's single charismatic leader, small size, newness, or dangerous or violent behavior. But in practice, it tends to be groups which are small and new to the country. That's what actually happens. If you actually look at laws that list cults, and there are such laws, and they have such lists in France and Belgium, some groups that many consider cults are listed there, some that you might find a little bit odd to be on that list. My personal favorite is the YWCA, which is on Belgium's Cult Observatory's list. That's the female version of the YMCA. So I just keep thinking of images of the Village People singing in my head every time that comes up, and I find this thing amusing. But this is actually on their list. It maybe says something a little bit about the ignorance of these policies, but they are there. And so we would expect discrimination against cults to be groups that can be identified as cults or are perceived as cults to be higher because of this whole anti-cult sentiment that is present in many Western and non-Western countries, for that matter. Theory number 4, going back to the classics, anti-Semitism. There is numerous polls showing anti-Semitism is present in Europe and the West. There's many studies finding correlation between that and anti-Israel sentiment. It's coming from both the left and the right. You have the right-wing anti-immigrant parties, many of which have anti-Semitic roots, although they're trying to downplay that a little now. It comes from the left in other ways. Some people from the left would dispute that, but most Jews sort of feel otherwise about that. And according to the left, the discriminate against minority gets to decide when they're being discriminated against. So we trump you on that one, no pun intended with any American politicians. But most Western governments tend to actively oppose anti-Semitism and are very careful about not discriminating against Jews. There is some discrimination, religious discrimination, as I measured against Jews in Europe and the West, but it's not out of line with levels that we might find against other religious minorities. So I'm actually expecting to find societal religious discrimination to be higher against Jews, but government religious discrimination not. So that's the four theories I'm comparing. Let's see which ones work. Now, I'm going to be using my religion and state minorities round 3 data set. Of the 183 countries and 771 minorities for which I have data, we're going to be focusing on European and Western Christian democracies. That is 156 religious minorities in these countries. This is every minority that hits a 0.25% mark or more. So it's relatively complete. I have yearly data, and you're going to see those results. I'm not going to discuss now how I collected the data because I'm limited on time. If somebody wants to ask me about that, I can get to that later. But what isn't, wait, so did I miss something? Oh yeah, all right, so, and I gotta go back here. Sorry, okay, now, but I do divide the minorities into categories for purposes theories. You have Christian non-civilizational. That would be a Protestant or Catholic minority and a Protestant or Catholic majority country, because Huntington considers all of those the same civilization. You have Muslim minorities, which clearly the Islamic civilization according to Huntington. You have Jewish minorities, which Huntington actually says Jews are the same minority of civilization of whatever country they live in. Apparently we're all a bunch of chameleons civilizationally, according to Huntington. I checked. I can find you the quote if you want it. You have Christian civilizational, which would be Orthodox Christians in Catholic or Protestant countries, or the other way around. We have other non-civilizational minorities, which are in practice, so if you look at the list, they're all groups that would be considered cults. And we have other civilizational minorities like Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Chinese religions, and so forth, which according to Huntington would be civilizational. So that's how we're dividing the world up. My societal religious discrimination variable has 27 distinct components, each a different thing, action that might be taken in society against a minority. These are the categories, but there are 27 different distinct ones. I list them in the paper. I don't really have time to discuss them here, but if somebody wants to ask about it, I can get into that. You add the measure together on a scale of 0 to 2, so you get a scale of 0 to 54. And these are all distinct actions. These are not opinions. We're talking about swastikas on synagogues, pigs' heads in front of mosques, attacks, assaults, verbal harassment, things like that. We're these are no opinion polls involved in this. Government-based religious discrimination has 35 components. These are all ways the government might restrict the minority religion in a way that it does not restrict the majority religion. This could be restrictions on religious practices. Those are relatively low. Religious institutions, much higher, like say making it difficult to build a mosque or other type of minority religious institution. Restrictions on the clergy, which are higher than you might think in the West. Restrictions on proselytizing and conversion. Proselytizing relatively high in the West, conversion not so high. It's almost non-existent. This is also measured on a scale of 0 to 2 for each component added together. So we have a scale that's theoretically 0 to 70. No minority hits 70, and that's a good thing. So here is the trend lines for societal religious discrimination. The first thing you're going to notice is Jews experience by far the highest levels of societal discrimination. Against Muslims, it is the second highest, a bit above the mean, but the Jews bring the mean so high that the mean doesn't really mean that much, and it started increasing just after the year 2001. So perhaps something that happened in 2001 might have spurred a little more discrimination in society against Muslims. Can't think of anything that might have happened in 2001. There's very little evidence for the societal hypothesis, for the civilizational hypothesis here. Jews are not a civilizational minority. Muslims are second highest, but if you look, one of the lowest ones are the lowest one is the other civilizational groups. If Huntington was right, and we have civilizational clashes, it should be against all civilizations, not just one and not the others. So his assumption doesn't hold up very well. When we move on to government religious discrimination. The patterns are a bit different. The levels against Jews fall to a little bit below the mean. The highest sort of moves back and forth between other non-civilizational and it was between other non-civilizational and, God, I need better glasses. But between other non-civilizational and Muslims, so when you have non-civilizational groups experiencing the same level as Muslims, again, things don't work out quite the way you would expect if Huntington was correct. And clearly the high societal religious discrimination against Jews does not translate into higher government religious discrimination, as I predicted, because the governments tend to not want to do that. Society doesn't feel quite as restrained. So when you put this into a multivariate analysis, the first two models look at societal religious discrimination, the second two look at government-based discrimination, and I marked in yellow those that are statistically significant. I'm gonna set the control variables aside. The only time minority being civilizational in any respect is statistically significant is in one of the models for societal discrimination, and civilizational minorities experience less discrimination. The Model 2 is really the better model. In Model 2, I pulled that one out and did specific minorities, and Muslims and Jews happen to experience more. You can't really use that variable with the other variables together because they overlap too much, which is why I have two models. Larger countries tend to have more societal discrimination for some reason that really escapes me. I haven't found a good reason for that. States which support religion, those with official religions, for example, are more likely to engage in religious discrimination. That's a well-known phenomena, but it doesn't tell you who they're going to discriminate against more. And minorities which engage in violence against the majority group are more likely to experience both societal and government discrimination, which makes sense. So what actually happens is one of the reasons discrimination against Muslim groups are higher is it's higher in countries where there's a history of violence, but not so much in countries where there isn't a history of violence, which is, again, not exactly what I would expect from Huntington's theory. So let's just go on and recap. Civilizational minorities experience less societal religious discrimination, no relationship for government religious discrimination. Muslim and Jewish minorities experience the most societal religious discrimination, but you don't have the Christian and other civilizational minorities also experiencing high levels of discrimination, so civilization doesn't explain that. Jewish and Christian civilizational minorities experience lower levels of government discrimination, which is also not very consistent with Huntington. But we have the minorities which engage in violence are very likely to experience discrimination. Some might say they experience discrimination because they engage in violence, but I used a time lag, so statistically I controlled for that as well as you can, but you can never be 100% sure. So the results are really quite consistent with the anti-Semitism hypothesis. They're quite consistent with the securitization of Islam hypothesis and the general securitization hypothesis. There's some support for the cult hypothesis in the bivariate analysis, but it doesn't really work out in the multivariate analysis, and we have very little support. The world does not look, at least the Western world and its treatment of religious minorities, does not look like we would expect if Huntington's theory is correct. So going back to the title of my paper, I'm going to call Balderdash. Also, given the overwhelming empirical evidence that contradicts the theory, why does Huntington's theory remain popular? I have a few thoughts on that. And first of all, it's a very convenient straw man when you're writing papers to say, here's Huntington's theory, and he's wrong, and here's my theory. That's unfortunately considered good academic writing, and Huntington's a great straw man. I am guilty of using him myself more than once. It is also so often discussed, it's sort of become an obligatory cite. There are papers where I never cited Huntington, and people, because he's not relevant, people are like, why didn't you cite Huntington? You just sort of have to work him in. If you focus selectively on the theory, it can provide an explanation for perceptions of Muslims being a threat. Those who would like to perceive Muslims as being a threat can read his theory selectively and find justification for that. And it's a very convenient theory to cite for people who wish to agree with multiculturalism and Westerners who, and it's also very popular for Westerners who are looking for some enemy. There are some people who are looking for enemies, and Muslims are really good enemies if you're looking for one, or at least they're very easy to portray as one. I'm not saying they're good enemies, they're very convenient enemies. Also, if one looks at the evidence selectively, as I would argue Huntington did, you can always find examples that support the theory. You just ignore the ones that don't. So that's my thoughts on why he remains popular, even though the theory really has very little empirical support. I believe I stayed within my 15 minutes. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Fox. I'm used to say that Huntington is quoted very often, but most of the time from people who did not read him. But I see you not only read him, but you studied him very, very consequently. And
you can't critique a theory properly if you don't know what they said.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for your very complex presentation. And to summarize, I would say, if we want to avoid discrimination, we have to strengthen the dialogue. That's
I don't disagree.
very good. So.